Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Filmmakers Guide to the Galaxy. We're here with Jude Poyer, stunt and fight coordinator. We're on episode 12. So welcome, Jude.
Thank you very much for having me.
How's it going?
It's all good, thank you. Yeah.
Good.
Keeping busy.
I don't know about that. I mean, like I guess most people in the industry, when lockdown happened, things shut down. So not as busy as I'd like to be, but I've got no major complaints.
Catch up on some movies and some TV, right?
I have been. I've been using the chance to sort of watch films that I should have watched, but perhaps haven't. I've been checking out Japanese films and Spanish films and some classics from the 70s. I watched The Conversation the other week. It was like that was on my shame list because I'd never seen
The Conversation. Yeah.
It was like on my list of shame, movies that I really should have watched.
Yeah.
Perfect time for all of that.
Yeah, very good time.
Okay, well, we'll just jump straight into some questions then. So we'll start off with Jude. What films would you say influenced you when you were younger?
Well, when I grew up, I consider myself like a child of the VHS generation. I grew up in the 80s, so I discovered a lot of movies by way of videotape as opposed to cinema. So when I was really small, I was watching the Bond films, I was watching Indiana Jones, Star Wars, Jaws, those films, and that created a passion for movies. And then in the mid 80s was when I saw my first martial arts film, and that was a ninja movie, and that's set off all kinds of light bulbs in my head there. So then I had a passion for martial arts, and I would watch whatever I could get my hands on, and it went pretty quickly from American B movies to the films of Bruce Lee, and then Jackie Chan, and then a bit later Jet Li, Sammo Hung, Yuen Biao, and then in my teens I was watching directors like John Woo and Ringo Lam, and they're still a big influence on my work.
Yeah, definitely. So like with you like the martial arts, when did you start studying, I guess, martial arts?
When I was, I think, 8 years old, I started with judo and then Shotokan karate, and I trained pretty diligently in Shotokan for quite a number of years. And then as I got more and more interested in the idea of performance and stunt work, then I just diversified a bit. And I like to say that I'm not good at any martial arts. I'm rubbish in lots of them. So I've just picked up bits of lots of different styles.
Yeah.
So how did you then get into doing stunt? Get into the stunt world.
For me, it was kind of an unconventional route compared to a lot of British stunt people. In that, when I was 18, I went to Hong Kong because I was watching Hong Kong films in the 90s. I was seeing Westerners like Cynthia Rothrock, Mark Houghton, Steve Tartaglia popping up in these movies and having fight scenes and playing characters and doing stunts. And I didn't think I was as good as those people, but I also saw some people that were really rubbish in those films. And I kind of thought, well, if they can get work in the industry, maybe I can. And when I was 18, I guess I could have gone to film school or drama school or done something a bit more conventional. But I thought, why not try and learn on the job in Hong Kong, get experience on sets and make a bit of money and work with some of the best in the industry, best in the world. And I was very fortunate that it kind of worked out for me. I was out there for 8 years.
Oh, wow. Brilliant.
So how old were you when you were doing that over there then?
I was 18 when I went out there.
Wow, okay.
Which is kind of ridiculous. I mean, I looked very young.
Like a long gap year.
Well, to be honest, that's kind of how I looked at it, in that if it doesn't work out, give it a year, you can always come back. I mean, people sort of say, oh, you're 18, that's really brave. And it's like, no, you've got no commitments at that age, or I didn't. And if things don't work out at that age, it's not the end of the world. It's very easy to come back and reset.
Yeah.
So I kind of looked at it as potentially like a gap year, but that gap year lasted 8 years, and I earned my citizenship, and I met my wife, and I learned the language, and all of that stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. So So carry on, James.
No, I was just going to say, like, so how many like projects did you do over there then in that 8 years?
I'm not sure. There was quite a few. I mean, obviously, some features I would have just been on for a day or two, and then other ones were more longer stretches of work. And then in addition to the feature films, there were TV shows, there were TV commercials and things like that. But I was pretty lucky in that I I was young, and also my skills weren't up to the standard of most Hong Kong stunt people. I'm probably the worst stunt guy to ever be a Hong Kong stunt man. So I was very lucky that in that time, with my young age and my relatively limited ability, I got to work with some of the best people. So, in front of the camera, Jet Li, Yun Bu, Jackie Chan, and then behind the camera, you've got people like Choi Hak and Sammo Hung, Tony Ching Siu Dong. So some of the best like action directors and action coordinators in the world. So it certainly informs how I work to this day, is influenced by those Hong Kong filmmakers.
Definitely.
Wow. So at what point did you find yourself making the switch from stunt performer or designing and choreographing the fights to, when did you take that leap? Was it over there or over here?
It wasn't a leap as such, in that I started coordinating small things when I was still in Hong Kong, which would have been around towards the end of 2003, 2004. And that's when I moved. 2004 was when I moved back to the UK. And then predominantly I was performing, but I would still get small bits of fight arranging or stunt coordinating. And it's quite normal that you don't necessarily make a hard switch. You just sort of move into doing more of the coordinating side. And there's a lot of very accomplished, busy stunt coordinators now that if they're between projects, they'll quite happily jump on another project as a performer for a few days. Where I am right now, I don't have a passion or a desire to perform. I mean, if I'm required to, I will, and I'll give it everything. But
Sure.
After all these years, now I'm more interested in the behind the camera creative side of things than being in front.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So then, what would you say was the big breakout film for you, which helped you with your fight choreography or stunt work? Anyone in particular?
Not really. I wish there was. Maybe I'm still waiting for it. It's much more of one of those things where it's a gradual process, and I try to soak up and try different things and learn on every job I do, whether it's small budget or big budget. I think there's something to learn, and it might not necessarily be directly related to stunt work. I'll be pestering the grips about what camera equipment they're using. I'll be asking the visual effects supervisor about the things that they do. And partly it is because I think that makes you a better action designer or action director or stunt coordinator, but also I love filmmaking. So there's not been like one job. I would say it's been more gradual. That when I first came back to the UK, I tended to work exclusively on things that were quite small budget and indie, unless I was performing. And just over time, you build up relationships and people recommend you, or directors or producers, their careers get bigger and their budgets get bigger and they ask you back. Yeah. And that's kind of what I've found. I mean, if you look at my CV, there are certain producers who I will have done 3 or 4 or 5 projects for.
Sure.
And you mentioned it about jumping between smaller indie films and bigger studios. So how different is the process of the action and stunt work, would you say, on those the difference between those films? I'm guessing like less time to do everything and less prep time and
Absolutely. I mean, on like an indie British project, there's usually almost next to no prep time, really. You might do a recce and you might get 1 or 2 rehearsals if you're lucky. But it's always, the way I look at it, it's always about having a conversation with the producers and the directors and saying, okay, what is achievable with your budget and with your schedule? And obviously, the more time you have to prepare, the more impressive things can be. But also, usually, you're able to build in more safety measures and make things safe. And the one thing I'm not going to do as a stunt coordinator is play fast and loose with safety just because they can't afford to do it.
Yeah.
I'll just say we need to put more money and time into this, or we need to find another way of doing it. There has to be a compromise somewhere. It may be that the director's ideal vision of seeing it all play out in one continuous shot needs to be compromised, and it needs to be broken down into 3 shots.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to let's say with an independent film, a low budget film, is suggest ways that make certain things no longer stunts. And say, okay, what's important here? Is it that you see this, or is it that the characters experience this? Whereas on a bigger budget production, then generally they kind of already know how far they want to go with the action and how much they're willing to spend. And normally on the bigger budget productions, the bean counters already have a pretty good idea how much things cost.
Yeah, you get experience with the bigger budgets. There's a reason, isn't there? The producers have been there before. They've done their time doing smaller projects. They know what to expect. Yeah.
I mean, I'll give an example. There was one independent film I did, which was it was a science fiction film called The Titan, and it was filming out in Gran Canaria. And I wanted to do a fight rehearsal in London when Sam Worthington was in London, and show him the choreography because he wanted to be part of that. And the producer, who's done quite a lot of films, just said to me, is that the best use of that budget? i.e. doing the rehearsal and using the stunt people. And I was able to explain to him why actually I did think it was better done that way. And he accepted it. And because it made sense to him. And, we rehearsed the fight, and then maybe a month or so, 2 months later, those same stunt people flew out to the Canaries to do the fight, and Sam had already met them and he had a rapport with them and so on. So it made sense. Sometimes when you're on indie films, people don't want to be told, and they kind of think that they can wing it. That can be a tough nut to crack sometimes. I mean,
it's the wing it thing that I bump heads with, and I'm like, you can't wing it, and sometimes if you're on an indie film but you've had loads of prep, they're the ones that look much more, much bigger than they are, because they've given themselves a lead up. Definitely.
Absolutely. And obviously prep costs money. And what I found on some jobs, by no means all of them, is that on the really independent ones, they want to do action. And I can explain to them, look, I'm very comfortable putting together a fight sequence on the day and giving you the best possible version of a fight sequence put together on the day, but it's not going to compete with films of a bigger budget or a version where we've actually rehearsed it weeks ahead of time and we've done a detailed previs, and they go, oh yeah, we like the sound of that. And I say, but what's the rehearsal rate? And it's like, guys, if you want high level stunt performers, they're going to want to get paid, and they're going to get paid the same for a rehearsal day as opposed to a shooting day. That's just like an economic reality. I don't make money by hiring those stunt people, so it's not like I'm trying to, line my own pocket. It's just a reality. But I would say for any independent filmmaker that wants to do genre, is just talk to your heads of department and be open to them, because sometimes if you talk to, let's say, not just stunts but special effects people, they'll explain to you, okay, you want that, and that's going to cost X, but have you thought about doing this instead? It will also look incredible, but it doesn't require 5 guys and a day of prep. It's that sort of thing.
It makes perfect sense. You always want to have that bit more prep time and also shooting time, but it's the money side always kicks in.
But that's where I think even on big budgets and small budgets, planning is key, and knowing ahead of time what you want to capture. I think there's certainly a place for improvisation with drama scenes, but I think when it comes to stunts and when it comes to action, it's not ideal to try and work it out on the day, because then you are spending money, i.e. people's time. by trying to do the creative stuff when you should actually be shooting.
I mean, I've been there, and I've done a few action films, and I've done ones where they've done previs, and the lead hasn't had all the prep, but the guy he's fighting, the stunt guy, has, which is fine. But at least the stunt guy knows what he's doing, and they've done previs. And then I've done some others where they're just like literally making it up over a coffee, and you're just like, okay. And then it gives me, I'm then told, point the camera, just sort of shake it, because we just know that they're going to start attacking, and then guy's just going to defend himself, It's just like, well, you haven't thought about all the key moments in this fight.
Yeah.
You've just gone, right, you attack you.
Good old shaky cam.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean. So, look, I don't think there's always absolutes with these things. I think sometimes the shaky cam can work, and the same times, sometimes shooting a fight scene as a series of masters is the quickest way to do it. But I don't think it gets the best results.
No.
And I think if you're doing a drama and you've got some fight or stunt element because it's required for the story, maybe then you can make my cat's talking. You can maybe rein in your ambition a little bit. But if you're specifically setting out to make a genre film, be it a Western or a martial arts film or a fight movie, you've got to deliver.
Yeah.
And the audience doesn't care that you only had 30 days to shoot the movie.
Yeah, that's
or that
problem,
you only had...
you always tell people that. You always go, but we made it during this and this and this, and there was a pandemic, and there was and people are like, I don't care, it looks shit.
That's it. The audience doesn't care, and I've been on indie films where it's like they'll say you've got a day to shoot a key fight sequence, and you'll say, well, that's not really enough. And then as the film progresses and they get behind schedule, that you've then got, we're going to knock off a couple of small scenes in the morning, but we'll get to you before lunch. In reality, they don't get to the fight until after lunchtime, and then you've got 4 hours. And it's like, guys,
I think
that's where
you butt heads, isn't? As a HOD, you'll butt heads with the first AD, and unless you have, say, the actor who's also a producer, a bit like I did with Scott Adkins, and he can put his foot down and goes, well, no, you're doing all that drama in one day, and I'm getting 2 days for this fight scene instead of half a day, and he did that on the film we just shot, and it was like, okay, great, we've got loads of time, and we smashed it,
Well, the thing is, it has to be, something's got to give.
Yeah.
And if you're doing an action film, if it's a Scott Adkins picture, obviously people have expectations of the drama and expectations that the cinematography is going to be of a certain level, but they're not going to tolerate if there isn't enough action and if the action's rubbish. So you have to make certain compromises.
Exactly the point he made.
A film that I will use as an example is The Raid. Now, The Raid was shot on the Panasonic, I think is AG or AF101. It's a micro four thirds camera.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
It's not a great camera, to be fair, in terms of pristine image and so on. I know they used an extra. If you look at The Raid on Blu-ray or on Netflix, it's not the nicest image going.
It's harsh, isn't it?
It's not the prettiest image. But you know what? I've never heard someone say, I hated The Raid because the cinematography was a little bit, and you could see some, the image, because they're sucked in by the action sequences, they're sucked in by the camera movement and the energy and so on. And if they'd said, I'm sure that they had conversations ahead of time, of what's it going to cost to shoot this on 35 millimeter? And they probably would have realized they needed an extra how many days, worth of money. Or they would have had to rein in, something has to give.
Yeah.
And I think for action, so you need a certain amount of time. I'm not really interested if someone asked me to do a feature film where you've only got a day to shoot like the main set pieces. It's just, I kind of feel like, what's the point? Gangs of London was a TV show, and even then we felt it was tight, but we would spend 3 days on some of those fights. I think if you're talking about stylized, sort of choreographed martial arts type action, I would say a minute of screen time per day of shooting is quite a healthy ratio to sort of aim for. And if that means some of it needs to be farmed out to a second unit, like an action splinter unit, so that that's possible, I think that's something that needs to be looked at. And I think it's a strange that particularly British independent films are kind of resistant to the idea of doing that. Whereas on Gangs of London, for instance, there were a few times where we would have the main unit shooting. We didn't have like a full-on second unit, but we would just have a reduced splinter unit to capture certain action moments, because that was the only way we were going to get all the shots that we needed.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I think that happens, a lot where you have to work out how you're going to do it and what's the most efficient way. Definitely.
Yeah, it always. I can never understand when I talk to people and they're talking about budgets and scheduling, even if like I said it's an action film or something or medieval film. They still never want to give too much time to like
what
finale battle scene or something. And it's like, but that's if you're going to watch this movie, that ending's you might be able to get away with it throughout the film, but that ending has to then deliver, and you can't skimp on it. Otherwise, what's the point of even making it?
And I think that the onus there is down to the producers.
Yeah.
Where do they want to spend the money? Because maybe the first assistant might not know if they've not got experience of it. And like you said, Simon, ideally, if you've got the actors, a producer, and they've got the ability to say, I know my audience and I know what the investors are expecting. Let's take a day from that and put it into the action.
Yeah, definitely.
But then again, it's on the sort of flip side, and this is the more sort of suspicious side to me, I would say that sometimes with directors who are less experienced with action, I think on a subconscious level, sometimes they almost want to reduce the amount of time for the action or push it away so that they don't actually have to get into it. Because it is a challenge, And
but me as a director, I'd love to do action in the future and stuff, because that's, if I want to do an action film, it's because I want to get stuck into the action and I want to make it great. Otherwise I wouldn't even tackle an action film if I didn't want to make that amazing, because otherwise what's the point? I give it to somebody, let somebody else do it. It's got the interest, and I'll make a drama.
Yeah, but I think some people like the idea of doing action, but maybe not the reality.
Do you tend to take over in terms of like you say, right, okay, we're done with the drama? I mean, like the action films I've done, I work with Tim Mann quite a bit, and the director will go and sit down, in the by the monitor and have a coffee or whatever, and then Tim will take over, almost directing the scene. And then every so often the director might chip in and say a few things, but he kind of lets, the fight choreographer kind of direct the scene, as it were. Is that how you work?
Some of the time, yeah. A lot of the time, certainly. I think in Hong Kong, that's the way it's done most of the time.
Right.
The first Hong Kong film I worked on was a movie called Downtown Torpedoes for Golden Harvest. And when I turned up on set, I recognized this gentleman whose name is Stephen Tung, and I thought he must be directing the film, because Stephen Tung's a former stuntman and martial arts actor, but he became an action director and directed a few films in his own right. So when I saw him, I thought, oh, he must be the director. He was actually the action sequence director. So he was stunt coordinating and choreographing and directing the action sequences. And then after the first couple of days, and then we were doing studio stuff, those scenes were initially being directed by Teddy Chen, but then the moment glass started breaking and people were jumping through windows, Teddy just went over to his desk and was doing paperwork and let Stephen Dong get on with it. Yeah. That's a very normal way. Yeah. That's the sort of the typical way it's done in Hong Kong. I don't think it's always the best way, because sometimes if there's not enough conversation between the director and his action director, you can end up with something that's slightly schizophrenic.
Yeah.
So it's, so tonally, it needs to be very clear what the whole picture is meant to be like. the year before last, I worked on Yip Man 4 in the UK as the UK stunt coordinator, and Yuen Wo-peng was the action director. And he was directing the action sequences that I was involved with, but Wilson Yip was there by the monitor. And they were communicating. Now, they never rowed, and Wilson never said, no, I don't think it should be on a 50mm. I think it should be on a 32. That sort of thing didn't happen. But there was just a communication to keep it tonally good. But I think if you do that, there needs to be trust and respect, because I have had the experience. I got asked about stunt coordinating a film. This is going back a few years. And the director, I think, had only done one picture before. Which didn't have stunts. And this film had a lot. And I said to the producer, I said, I'm not interested in just stunt coordinating this. If you want me to action direct it, I'd be very interested. And the producer saw the sense in that. I think the director found it hard to relinquish the control.
Right.
Because obviously they wanted to direct the action sequences. And the way I look at it is rather like most directors, with the exception of maybe John Carpenter, don't know how to compose music. So they will talk to their composer about what they want, and then together they will find a soundtrack score that works for the director's film. But it does require relinquishing to a certain extent. And with this director, I would give him previs for most of the fights. And if there were notes, and they were usually very minimal, like, okay, I love it, but instead of a profile there, could I make that a top shot? Yes. But then when it came to filming, he wasn't comfortable not being on set. And then when we were filming, he would be shouting out, cut, yes, let's move on, and stuff like that. And I think the crew felt uncomfortable because they didn't know who they were meant to be listening to. You know, and I found that when we were on second unit, we would just move a lot quicker and we would get through the action a lot faster. And I would say that the stuff that was done on main unit with me action directing, and then the stuff that we did on second unit, it all cut together very well. It didn't have that schizophrenic feel, but that was because it had been prevised ahead of time.
Yeah.
But I would say the UK is still very resistant to this sort of previs idea, and still very resistant to sort of action directing. And I think perhaps it's because our industry is still a little bit snobbish. And I think stunt people maybe are still a little bit seen as physical people as opposed to filmmakers.
Yeah.
Whereas in Hong Kong, typically the action director is a former stunt person. In India, it's the same. And then obviously in America, you've got Chad Stahelski, David Leitch. They worked on the Matrix movies. They learned under Master Yuen Wo-peng, and then they went back to Hollywood, and 8711 became something. And then they weren't just the go-to action designers, but they could be trusted to second unit action direct it.
Yeah.
And I think on the big movies where there's studios involved and people that wear suits, the directors a lot of the time don't get a say. It's like, this is your second unit director. He's going to be doing the car chase.
Yeah.
You know,
and we discussed that with Sam Hargrave the other week, you know, about how, you know, you might have a visual effects guy supervising second unit or being second unit director, because it's, you know, they know what they're doing, you know, and they now have, you know, second unit director and stunt coordinator in the same job, you know, and they're more entrusting with that.
I think that's why if you can previs, and production can spend the money to do that, that's where the opportunity arises for the director to look at the previs and say yes or no. Actually, yes or no, or I'd like to include these elements, or I'm not sure about that, and then you just refine it. I was very lucky to work on Kingsman as a performer. The fight sequences were directed by Brad Allen, who's an Australian gentleman formerly of the Jackie Chan stunt team. Now, obviously, he doesn't just go to set and do what he wants. He's worked on that previs with his team, and then Matthew Vaughn has cast his eyes over it, and I'm sure he gives his input. But Matthew Vaughn isn't going to tell Brad Allen, don't use that punch, use this punch, you know. But when it came to filming in the church, Matthew Vaughn was there for the drama elements. So when Colin Firth's sitting there and there's the hate preacher and all of that stuff. And then the moment Colin Firth pulled out his gun and pulled the trigger, it becomes the second unit.
Yeah.
And then it's Brad Allen's set for the next, I think, 8 shoot days to get that fight scene done.
Yeah.
And obviously Matthew Vaughn's had Brad Allen come back for the sequel and for the prequel and so on.
Yeah.
That he recognizes the value that an action director brings to his projects.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. So you just moving on to a film you did a year or so ago. So you worked on Final Score with Dave Bautista and other amazing actors. And one key piece was the elevator scene, which I think we've all sort of seen and in trailers and all sorts. So how did you go about sort of planning for this? Obviously using previs, but what was the techniques that you had to bring into choreographing this fight scene?
We actually didn't previs that as such. I shot like blocking tapes,
right?
Because we knew that wasn't going to be a second unit action directing type thing. Scott Mann, the director, is a lovely guy, was likely to shoot that fight his way.
Okay.
But the approach to the choreography, and I was fortunate, the stunt coordinator basically, for the most part, left me and Chris Webb to get on with the choreography. And I've known Chris Webb for about 25 years now. He's been one of my longest friends, and now he's kind of like my right-hand man on the projects I do with Gareth Evans. But it was the first time working closely with Chris. And the remit was, we're in an elevator, there's 2 big guys, there's a third guy, and there is a gun. And I have this thing that even if the audience doesn't see every single detail, because you don't know how it's going to be photographed, of course, it needs to feel like a fight. That doesn't necessarily mean it's realistic, but within the world of that movie, it needs to feel like a fight. So the question that I kept returning to was, why hasn't somebody in this elevator picked up that damn gun and shot somebody? And so that became our thing. So we just started choreographing, Chris and myself, and then first thing is, right, we need to get that gun out of who turned out to be Lee Charles's hand. Okay, why hasn't Dave picked up the gun? And we also choreographed it within a space the size of an actual elevator in that football stadium.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Well, we looked at some movies where there'd been elevator fights, and on some of those elevators, you looked like you could drive a car into it.
Yeah.
And I thought, where's the fun in that? The elevator fights that I remember, I think Diamonds Are Forever had a very good one. Obviously, it's dated in bits of its time, but you feel the sense of claustrophobia. So we measured out, or I'd say Chris measured out the proportions, and then we built with fake walls and crash mats something the size of that. And we just played in there, choreographing, and we had a lot of time actually to do, because we had a fairly decent prep, and the fight was quite late in the schedule, the shooting schedule. So even during shooting, we could get Dave in, we could get Lee in, we could get Rob de Groot, who's David's stunt double, in, and we could just run through the fight over and over and over. But the main thing was just refining it and sort of trying to take out anything that felt a little bit bullshit. You know, we wanted to have this sense that these 2 guys are really fighting. Yeah. And the third guy, who's kind of like comic relief, but you really want to feel that he can't get out of the way and he can't pick up that gun. And so that's what we did. And so Chris and I had it down, and then Rob joined the film, and we worked with Rob. And because Rob's Dave's stunt double, you know, he's taller and he's bigger, so he gave us input in terms of, well, this might be difficult for someone of Dave's size to do. So we modified it for that, and then Dave came in, and I was nervous at first because I had all these preconceived ideas about what kind of person Bautista would be. I had no right to have these ideas, but I just saw him as this huge, hulking alpha male that doesn't smile a lot, and I thought, oh, he could be hard work. Actually, he's a real gentleman. He's quite softly spoken. Yeah. And he will question ideas, but it's never in an unpleasant or confrontational way. And if you can convince him, he's okay with it. So he told us some elements that he'd like to include, and we would modify to suit that. there's another fight later on in a kitchen where Martin Ford's fighting Dave. And Chris and I initially had choreographed that so Dave was a bit more sort of superhero. And Dave actually said to us, guys, this guy's a monster. For those that don't know, Martin Ford's 6'9".
Ford, yeah.
You know, so he makes Dave look small, and Dave said, "This is the only time the audience is going to get to see me fight a guy like this." And I hope I can swear. I didn't ask you. You know, he said, "I want him to treat me like a piece of shit." So we made it less heroic, and we made it more about Dave's character struggling and overcoming the odds. And that was fun to work with an actor, because the thing about Dave is obviously he's a martial artist and he's a former professional wrestler. So he knows choreography and he knows storytelling through action. Yeah. And he can fight on camera better than a lot of stunt people. And one of the elements that wasn't in the script was a knife gets lost in a fat fire. And it wasn't in the script, but the... Martin forces Dave's hand into the fat fire in the script, and he grabs the knife and pulls it out and stabs Martin. And I remember having like a light bulb moment where I said to Chris, hang on a minute, Martin hasn't been in the room when that knife went in the fat fryer, but Dave was. I said, wouldn't it be more interesting if Dave chose to stick his hand in this hot bubbling fat to grab the knife and stab? Doesn't that tell us more about the character? Because I'm interested in learning about characters and conveying characters through action. And that was something that Dave absolutely loved, because it was not just a cool stunt or a cool bit of choreography. It said something about the lengths that this character was willing to go to, that he would plunge his own hand into hot fat. Yeah. So that was great. But when it came time to shoot the fights, we didn't have an awful lot of time. It was more like a typical sort of British film, not a small budget, but I think for the kitchen fight we had like a day of main unit and then a day of splinter unit, where a lot of the time we were using Dave's double. And then when it came to the elevator fight, I think we shot that in under a day. But the thing is, if you look at final score, it's more of that. I wouldn't say shaky cam, but it's more of shoot lots of different pieces, lots of coverage, and then the editor can assemble it. I'm pretty sure it was shot at 8K and mastered at 2K. Right. So there was a lot of ability to repo shots, make things seem like you're cutting to a different lens when actually you weren't. And all I did there as the sort of assistant stunt coordinator, stroke fight coordinator, is I basically broke the fight down into what I thought were manageable chunks. And they would mop up each chunk from every angle that they wanted to. Yeah. And then we would move on. And the elevator for that was the size of a real elevator, but some of the walls floated, the ceiling floated, because there was no way you were going to fit a camera operator, in there.
Amazing.
Yeah, definitely.
So you then got to work with Gareth Evans. Was it first of all on The Apostle, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, so how did that come about? And it was interesting because he's, obviously, you mentioned earlier on about his style of action. It kind of suits your style of filming of action as well.
Yeah, the way I look at Gareth as an Asian filmmaker, in the sense that the way he approaches action is very similar to most Hong Kong filmmakers, that we don't shoot our fights in montage and in coverage. We don't do multiple cameras for loads of duration of time and then work out in the edit how it's going to cut together. I'm not saying you should never do that. I think there are circumstances. I think Tony Scott was very good at that. I think Michael Bay is sometimes very good at that. Sort of you get the sense of frenetic energy.
Just a bit.
Sometimes. Yeah. But with Gareth, it's more specific. It's more motivated. Every angle, every camera move, every cut has a purpose and has a motivation. So we're kind of similar in that way. As far as I understand, Gareth's obviously a big Hong Kong film fan. And I think Gareth was aware of me because I was one of the few British people that had worked in Hong Kong quite a bit. And Apostle was the first project he did back in the UK. And he reached out to a mutual friend of ours, Mike Leader, who'd worked on The Raid 2, to get my details. So I got contacted by a producer from Wales saying, "Oh, we're doing this film called Apostle for Gareth Evans. Would you be interested?" And I was like, "Yeah," And initially I was a little bit nervous because I didn't know what kind of person Gareth was, and obviously I'd seen his work and it's a very high standard, and sometimes that can mean the person isn't necessarily the easiest person to work with or the nicest person, but actually, while Gareth is certainly demanding of himself and of his crew and of what we're trying to design, he's the nicest person on earth. He's very easy to work with, and it's a very comfortable environment. So on Apostle wasn't obviously an action feature. It was a folk horror, but it had a few fight moments.
Yeah, that's right.
I think we probably did just like 5 or maybe 6 days of previs on that. And then we did the shoot, and it was just great. I think for me, I was used to the Hong Kong way of shooting. I think for a lot of the crew, it was the first time that they'd seen a video previs that was literally followed shot for shot.
Right.
In that, I think sometimes in the UK people talk about previs and really they're just paying lip service, and it's more like a blocking tape,
right?
Or it's here's something to show the director or show the actors what the fight is. But with Gareth, it was pretty close. Now, obviously, we were shooting on a handycam, so there were slightly different lens characteristics and so on. And that's where Matt Flannery makes what Gareth shoots look really good. But the previs would be loaded on an editing laptop. And as we shot the fight sequences, the footage from the red camera would get piped down to the laptop, and Gareth would just be cutting from previs into the actual production footage, and you could see the sequence come alive in front of you. And if he needed to go again, it was obvious, it was plain why, but it also meant we never went again unnecessarily. We didn't do, let's do that really dangerous bit of stunts again, just in case, or just so we've got an option. It was like, that works, let's move on. So and I think the Welsh crew, the British crew, it was eye-opening, but I think everybody saw the value in previs, and I think the actors particularly saw the value in it, because I'd go to a fight rehearsal and teach, let's say, Dan Stevens a fight, and I'd show him the previs, and the first thing he's asked is, are we going to be expected to do the whole fight? I was like, no. You're going to be expected to do it in these chunks with maybe a second of action either side, just so that there's a little bit of movement, flexibility in the edit points. And then the actors, the way I compare it, it's the difference between running a kilometer or running 10 100-meter sprints.
Yeah.
Where you can give it your all for 100 meters and then,
Yeah.
And so I think it's a really useful tool, previs.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I was actually just going to jump ahead in our questions, just because you brought it up in terms of the style of his filmmaking, but there are not too many cuts like some modern fight scenes in what he does. It's more like you said, the older sort of Asian cinema style of filmmaking, where if you cut, you're cutting to on a specific beat to tell that story. How does this style of choreography and filmmaking, how does that influence your decisions on what you can accomplish in the fight scene to tell that story?
In terms of me choreographing it?
Yeah, like if someone attacks someone and then, like the scene in the pub in Gangs of London, and you do a close-up of the hand and then that, those little key points where the camera pushes in, how does knowing the Asian style of cinema help you work that out?
Well, just to give you sort of an idea of the process, when I work with some directors, obviously I action direct. And when I work with other directors, they're not interested and they just literally want me to choreograph something or, make it safe, and that's fine. With Gareth, what I tend to do is get his brief for the scene and I'll choreograph it. And if he's present, which is the ideal situation, then he can start shooting the fight in the sections that he feels is right. If he's not present, I'll shoot a blocking video for him, but it won't be a previs. I'll just be like, here's something for you to look at, cast your mind over. But initially, when we shoot the previs, I think Gareth's kind of led by his instincts. And he will just look for where the logical edits are and where a shot seems to run out of steam or where a shot's not necessarily telling the story. And one thing that I'm very aware of is I don't like action choreography that's in service of a gimmick, let's say. So I'm not saying you should never do one-ers or what feel like one-ers with stitched shots, but it should never be. We should never compromise the let's say the choreography or the performances.
Yeah.
Because the camera's over there, or I need to turn this way to make that punch sell, and you can feel that, I think, with some of the more gimmicky fights. But with Gareth, he's led by his instinct. He finds his shots, and then it's just a case of refining.
Yeah.
And he will, sit down and edit it, and we'll just do it bit by bit in a quite a relaxed environment. It's quite chilled. He'll edit, and who knows? Sometimes he'll say, "Oh, I think we need another angle here," or actually, I did that top shot, but I don't think I need it. Sometimes we will perform maybe like a 20-second bit of action, and he will shoot it almost as a series of mini masters, but then cut it up. But then when we film it for real, it's not a series of mini masters. It's specific to the previs. And certain things like the dart going through the webbing of the hand, that's something that I think that was an image that Gareth had in his head before we started choreographing, because he knew he wanted the dart, and I think he knew he wanted that image. So let's say if I'm on something very low budget and time restrained, I might say to a director, okay, you want someone to get hit by a car. These are the ways we can do it quickly and safely. You have a camera on the outside where the stunt guy jumps up and hits the bonnet, but also we'll have a camera on the inside, undercranked to 22 frames per second, and you'll get that body coming towards, hitting the windshield. And then and I'll dictate it like that. Whereas with Gareth, I'd rather he dictates the shots ideally he wants, and then we all work together to try and achieve that. And that may mean saying, actually, boss, there's a moment in there that needs to be a stunt double, so we need to find a way to get from our actor to a stunt double. And then he might go, okay, well, let's put an invisible stitch in there. Let's have somebody wipe past frame, which allows us to do that. Or let's employ visual effects. But I wouldn't want to, on something like Gangs of London, because it's Gareth Evans and the audience have expectations that the action's going to be of a certain level, I don't want to start trying to rein him in terms of his vision. I'd rather help him get the shots that he wants. And I don't think he would stand for it if I did try and rein him in. But also, what's great about Gareth and where he is so wonderfully collaborative is he will indulge me if I go, can we just try something? How about if we put the camera here and did that?
Yeah.
And he won't go, well, I'm quite happy with we'll try it, and he'll edit it, and then we'll see. And we don't really have a hierarchy when we're action designing between Gareth, myself, or my stunt team. Everybody's there in service of the project.
Yeah.
So we will interrogate ideas. We will rip each other's ideas to shreds or build them up. And it's never a sense of, well, that's Gareth's idea or that's Chris's idea, so we need to listen to it. And it just leads to, I think, a better action sequence because no one's trying to defend their ego. I mean, I personally believe I don't have ideas. They're not my ideas. They're just ideas that are out there. And if I didn't snatch them, somebody else would at some point. And I think Gareth and I and Chris were all quite well tuned into each other. So to sort of go back to your question, because I've been sort of waffling.
No.
Sometimes Gareth has specific ideas that are there long before we start choreographing. Yeah. So like the fight with Len.
Just those key moments. Yeah,
like Len, played by Lee Charles in episode 1, the sort of butcher guy. Gareth really wanted that meat cleaver to go into the wall at a certain angle. And it was kind of difficult to come up with a way that was convincing that it would do that. And Chris and I would scratch our heads and we went, and we'd done Apostle. But beyond that, we hadn't worked with Gareth that closely. And it was like, and we got to a point where we realized if we gave things a scoring system, we could find out how important certain things were to Gareth. So we would say, Gareth, out of 10, how important is that for you? And if he said the cleaver going into the wall, that's a 10, we would do everything to make that happen. But certain other ideas that might be in the script, or he might just have come out with in sort of spitballing, that might be a 7, or it might be a 5. And so things are always changing. And like that fight at the end of episode 1, it's meant to be a fight with a guy in a DOS house involving a meat cleaver, but the mattress isn't in the script. The pipes in the wall weren't in the script.
Right.
The fact that Lee's only wearing welly boots and underpants wasn't in the script.
He just turned up like that.
Lee probably would. It was something that came out of conversations where I was talking to Chris, and we were actually doing a location recce, and we were in a place that potentially could have been where we shot that fight, and there was a small washroom, and Gareth had explained there's going to be a dead body in the bathtub that's been cut up, and Chris said, what do you think he's wearing if he's cut up a body? Is he wearing an apron? Is he wearing a paper suit? And I said, it's central London. I think he's naked. I think he's going to cut up that body, wash himself down, and then throw on his street clothes and walk out onto the streets because he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. So I remember saying to Gareth, we think Len should be in underpants and welly boots. And we're always like winding each other up. And he gave us a look like, oh, boys. And we were like, no. And we kind of told him why. And what's great about Gareth is he won't dismiss an idea. I've worked with plenty of directors that if you give them a suggestion, if it's not their suggestion, it's rubbish.
I don't want it, yeah.
You know, or even some directors, if you give them a suggestion when no one else is around, then they can own it and they can go, guys, this is what we're going to do. You know, yeah. But Gareth's not like that. We talked about Len being in his underpants on a Friday, and then we just left him with it. We didn't push it. We let him percolate it. Because if Gareth doesn't go with an idea, usually, I would say every time, actually, he's right. Because when I see the finished sequence, I go, yeah, that was better for not doing that. But on the Monday, he came in and said, yeah, guys, I think you're right. And I think that just helped change that fight sequence. It just gave it that extra edge because in the pub fight, which is quite fun, we sort of hint that Elliot has done judo, so he's grabbing people by the lapels of their jackets and by their sleeves. Right, yeah. And I thought, if he's fighting a guy who's naked, he can't use any of those tricks. They're nullified. And then the guy's bloody and he's sweaty. And that was also something that I was influenced by an early UFC fight I saw, where a judo champion was fighting Ken Shamrock. And the judo guy was a big guy, he was strong, he was wearing his gi. And Shamrock was wearing these tiny wrestling trunks and little boots. And the judo guy was a great fighter, but he just didn't have anything to reply to this guy because his techniques were nullified. So yeah, that's I get my inspiration from all kinds of things, and UFC is one of them.
Yeah. So in terms of like you were saying about the camera and things like that earlier, but in terms of how. How's the choreography and the camera choreography? How do you work with it? Obviously, you previs, say, like on an iPhone or whatever you're going to use in the rehearsal space. But at what point do you start talking to the DP? Like, I mean, I know from my own experience, I'm shown, a few weeks in advance the previs, and I can chat to the choreographer. But sometimes I can't make the previs, or discuss it or rehearse it. How was the DP on Gangs of London involved? Was he? In terms of doing those things?
Well, we had three DPs because we had three directors. But Gareth's DP, Matt Flannery, is co-creator of the show.
Okay.
And Matt has been with Gareth from the start.
Yes,
he did Maranto, he did the Raid films. Yeah. So they've got a wonderful working relationship and a shorthand. When we prevised, I don't like to use phones for previs just because the lens characteristics are so different.
Yeah.
It's kind of impossible to replicate on a phone unless you've got an app, on there, what it's going to look like on a larger sensor cinema camera. Yeah. So I think for Apostle, Gareth used a Handycam, but then for Gangs of London, we used my GH5S with a couple of different lenses. But we were lucky that most of the time when we previs, Matt Flannery was present.
Right. Okay.
And when it comes to the camera work, rather like I will try not to step on Gareth's shoes. I like to let him find his shots. Matt does the same, but Matt is an observer, so at least he understands the geography and he understands what the intent was behind that shot when we came up with it. So that's really, really helpful.
Yeah. Does he give? Obviously, because I haven't been to previs. I've done like maybe one previs once before, but like I said, I'm usually given the previs and then I'll discuss it afterwards. But are you? Is he like, you know, going, oh, maybe we can do this angle, or are those decisions in terms of angles and those the smaller things left to the day of filming?
No, we don't like to deviate from the previs on the day, because normally if you deviate, because I'm talking specifically with Gareth's stuff, if you deviate from a previs, a good previs, a refined previs, if you deviate for it, you're setting yourself up for a fall, because it just sets off this domino effect of where all of a sudden edit points aren't working, lens changes aren't working. So no, we try and stick to the previs pretty closely. And I think if you look on Gareth's Instagram, for instance, he's put up some side-by-sides where you can see Gangs of London previs. And there will be changes, or I'd say the most notable differences will be where we've shot a previs quite quickly and Matt's composed the frame more nicely. He's not cut off someone's head or whatever. But other changes would be where we were up against it time-wise, or if, as it was being edited, Gareth thought, I do need an extra angle here. But no, Matt is a collaborator and he's a creator, so he won't tell Gareth how to shoot the fight. But rather, like, I feel comfortable suggesting a shot or an alternative, I would hope that Gareth's collaborating DP would feel the same. So there is that. But what's more sort of useful is just by Matt being there, we can sort of put out not fires but stop things not becoming problems. For instance,
that's what I was thinking.
In the pub fight, there's a couple of top shots, and in there's a scene earlier on in the Travelers Camp where there's top shots, and Gareth and Matt will talk about the visual language of the fight, and what we don't want is that all of a sudden we've got this handheld style, and we don't do shaky cam, but it's handheld figure with a little bit of movement and
That's
energy.
Gareth's sort of feel for the raid as well and things like that, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When we go top shot, we don't suddenly want to lose that.
Yeah.
So then it sets off a conversation about, okay, how
do we strap someone to a plank?
It's pretty close to what they did.
I saw the photos.
So then Gareth will talk to Matt will talk to his grip, and they'll come up with a way to make that happen. On episode 5, there's a shot where the camera's on something like a jimmy jib or a crane, but it's I've forgotten.
But he's sitting on the end of it.
No, not on this one, because
we
did do that in other scenes, but in Ep 5 there was a shot where there's a jetty and the camera's running parallel along, and if you wanted the camera to do that handheld, you would have had to build a second jetty, which would have cost a lot of money and taken a lot of time to break. So they had it on an arm, but they had this system, I think it's called the Mimic system, where Matt is in a little tent hand holding this console, and the camera mimics his handhold feeling.
It was on the movie.
It was something I hadn't seen before. So he's way over there, and then so that's the kind of thing where Gareth and Matt will talk about maintaining a certain style within the action.
So you're talking. You mentioned episode 5, and that was like a mini movie in itself with the big house siege. An amazing episode. How much work went into that episode and the planning and the implementation of it? Because it was like a full-on 20 minutes, half an hour set piece.
I think about half the episode is action, and I remember when I read the script for that before I'd even started any kind of pre-production, I was like, this is going to be special. With Gareth directing it, it has the potential to be something really special, and I think it's turned out really well. And it's not just about the action, it's also about how Gareth sets it up, the tension, the relationships, and so on. I can't remember off the top of my head how much time we spent prevising, but we did spend quite a lot of time months before pre-production. So pre-production, prevising the interior of the house and the stuff that goes on in there. For the whole series, we had 3 months of action design before we started shooting to cover most of the set pieces. And then we did a few more days down in Wales where we prevised the exterior of the house. We didn't get to previs every single moment, so certain things had very rough storyboards, like the stuff on the jetty at the end. But there was a lot of previs, and then based on those previews, I would sometimes add in very rudimentary, very ugly visual effects, sort of bullet hits or explosions. So then the special effects people, the visual effects people know what's expected of them. The costume people get an idea of maybe how many costume repeats are going to be required. And I don't know how many days we shot on that episode, but basically episode 5, and then the end action of episode 3, the opening of episode 3, and then a couple of other smaller set pieces were all done in Wales in its own block. So Gareth was directing action unit for some of the other directors. And I think we did 37 shoot days for that block.
Wow, okay.
It didn't feel like, for Ep 5, it didn't feel like we had bags of time to try and achieve what we wanted to do. Even though it had been previous, I would have loved to have had more time. So there were a couple of moments when we were like, okay, we better get this on take 1.
Yeah.
But it had some such incredible stuff, like the bit when the guy jumps through the roof and the camera goes down with him. You know, there's some amazing like little stunt beats in there as well, which are great.
I noticed things like that from the raid as well.
I mean, in the raid, it kind of...
They went through the hole in the ceiling, I think, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this one is even more, like, impressive, and I have to say, I'd love to take credit for that, but that's 100% Gareth's mind. And for me, it was just about how do we implement that and make that possible. And actually, from the stunt side, it was really low-tech and simple. And it also didn't take an awful lot of takes.
Yeah.
You know, but I'm really happy that things like that, people go, whoa, because I think they don't expect it of television.
Yeah,
you know.
it was definitely a different standard, especially with British TV. It's,
I mean, in terms of in terms of standards and stuff, like what's like the most challenging stunt or choreography sort of fight that you've done or had to coordinate in your career so far? Would you say?
You know, I honestly don't know, because at the time I probably stressed about a few things, but after the fact, you kind of just go.
When you're like, thank God they're alive. Then
well. To be honest, when I'm working with Gareth, there will be stress, because I know that the expectation is high and the barrier is high. But he's very supportive and very collaborative, and also you've got more money to play with, and you've got experienced people around you that you can lean on. So the special effects people, the visual effects people, we can all put our heads together and say, okay, what if I did this? What if I did that? That's how we can achieve this crazy shot that the directors come up with. And also, because the budget's there, I will lean on more experienced stunt people for certain things. So I consider myself pretty okay at wire work. But for gangs, because it was a big job, I had a man called Dave Judge come in and rig some of those stunts, because he's much better at rigging than I am. And then I can just focus more on like the general picture of things. I would say what's actually in many ways more stressful is some of the smaller pictures I've done where the brief hasn't been so clear. And you never know quite what. You're not getting enough time, but also, or even information. You know, I did a film called A Private War, which was a movie I'm very happy to have been part of. And it was about Marie Colvin, this journalist for the Sunday Times who ultimately got killed in an airstrike in Syria. And it was a story I thought needed telling, and it looked at the subject of PTSD, which I thought filmmakers usually don't get that right. Usually they only sort of scratch the surface, but I thought this script had more insight into that. Rosamund Pike's a great actor.
Well, Rob Richardson was a DP as well, wasn't he? Tarantino's DP,
absolutely. So you got Bob Richardson. I mean, not just Tarantino. He lensed Casino, which is one of my favorite films. And then the director on that, then Matthew Heineman, was from a documentary background, and his documentaries are pretty powerful. I mean, Cartel Land and things like that. They're very real. But I got the sense with Matt that he wanted things to be very real, where when you're doing stunt work, you have to create the illusion of things being spontaneous, but actually it needs to be done in a very controlled way. And I felt sometimes we weren't always being told what was expected until just before. Because maybe they thought that was a way to imbue the film with a certain sense of energy or unpredictability. Well, actually, I don't like to work that way. I like to know what's expected so I can give the director what they want.
Yeah.
And so that was in many ways more of a challenge.
Right. Yeah. So not so much the stunts themselves; it's just more the circumstances. The trickiest, sometimes the trickier things.
A lot of the time it's like, because of what happened for real, that two of your lead characters are going to get hit by an explosion and one of them's supposedly going to get killed. That's coming up, but you don't know quite where on the set it's going to happen, and you don't know quite where the camera's going to be. And then it's a case of, okay, well, dealing with the special effects people, like, okay, how close to these pyros can the actors be? And then talking to the art department about how do we protect the actors? Ultimately, it's in the trailer. I'm not spoiling it, anyone. Jamie Dornan and Rosamund Pike run out of this media center with the camera following them, and then there's a big explosion, knocks them to the floor.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what I had there was, we were on an abandoned building site in Jordan, and it wasn't the easiest place to work. I had the production cover a large area of the floor with like foam jigsaw mats like you get in gyms. And then it just got covered in sand and soft rock and soft rubble. And it seemed, perhaps to a casual view, it might seem overkill that we covered like maybe a large area, but I didn't know exactly the spot the actors were expected to go down. And, I got some snarky comments from Bob, because of the lengths that I'd gone to. But Jamie Dornan walked out there and he felt the ground under his feet and he said, "I love what you've done with it." Because he knew he could just go for it.
Yeah.
And also because it's not prevised and it's not Gareth Evans' world, they're not going to hit the floor once.
Yeah.
They're going to hit the floor a few times until the director feels that he's got the shots that he wanted. And Matt didn't want to use stunt doubles for that. So it's Rosamund Pike you're asking to throw herself to the floor repeatedly. And that's obviously more stressful, because I know that with Gareth, because he's very action savvy, I can say to him, I think this needs to be a stunt double. And if he says, well, if he really needs it to be the actor, he'll say to me, what are the ways we can make it safe for the actor to do it? And we can have a conversation. Or if I say, no, this one has to be a double, he'll be like, okay. And then it's a conversation about how do we cut from the actor to the double and maybe make it seamless. Do we do face replacement? So it's just good to have information.
Yeah,
it's good
definitely.
to plan.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what's next for you then? Do you yourself anything like coming up, after lockdown? And also, do you see yourself moving into directing in the future at any point?
Well, that's two. I'll answer the first question first. I'm going to work with Gareth again. We've already done a couple of months of previs for his next feature film, which is called Havoc. I don't know yet when that's going to be shot, but I'm really, really excited about that project. And I would say that if you liked Gangs of London's action, you'll like what we do in Havoc, because what we've designed, genuinely, humbly, we've taken it to another level. If the action in Gangs of London wasn't to your liking, you're probably not going to like what we've done with Havoc. But I think Gareth's fans and the people that have been crying out for the Raid 3, I think they'll be happy with Havoc. So that's somewhere on the horizon. In the short term, I really don't know. I was actually working on a musical heist film, which had just started when lockdown happened, and they had to shut down on day one of filming.
Oh, no.
And quite a different movie,
Yeah.
not action heavy. I wasn't prevising.
So was it singing cats and then things like that?
No cats, no cats, and no CGI digitally hiding anatomy of cats and all of that. It was just a different film, but it was a nice script, a nice director, and I like to mix it up. I like to do the action heavy and intensive stuff, but also I like to do something a bit unusual, a bit quirky. Do like a dumb, fun action film like Final Score, and then do something like A Private War or Farming, which is more serious.
Yeah.
But in terms of directing, maybe one day, I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, right now, I'm quite confident in my ability to action direct and to direct fight scenes and direct action sequences. If you asked me a few years ago, James, I would have probably said, I want to be a director, because I'd worked with a lot of directors that actually weren't that good. But I've had a chance to work with some really, really good directors, and that's when I go, actually, I've got a lot to learn.
You realise how hard it is. Yeah.
It's not just how hard, but like when they do a good job. I mean, I know Gareth Evans as an action collaborator and as someone that's really good at directing action sequences, and I know him as a friend. But when I watch Gangs of London, and I'll watch a scene where you've got 15 gangsters sat around a table having a conversation, and he just keeps the energy going and he keeps the geography clear, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I would actually be able to do something seemingly as innocuous as people sat around a table and make it feel interesting and real. So that, and also working with good actors and seeing how they respond. Different actors have different processes, and I'd like to get more of an understanding about how different actors like to work. And then of course it would depend on the script, because if I got a chance to direct something, it wouldn't be the first thing that I was offered. It would be something that I believed in a script that I thought was good.
Yeah. And in terms of we're just sort of wrapping it up now, but in terms of advice for people wanting to get into making action films or become a stunt coordinator or stuntman, or making action films in general, let's say, is there any sort of tips or advice that you could give those people who are watching now or watching in the future?
Sure. I would say get as much experience as you can, and I would say you don't have to be a stunt coordinator to be a director of action. I think it certainly helps because you gain experience that way, and you work with, like I was lucky enough to work with some of the best in the business, so I pick things up from them. But I would say if you want to be a stunt coordinator, work as a stunt performer for a long time. Work with different stunt coordinators and get experience performing different kinds of stunts and witnessing different kinds of stunts being put together. Because really, you shouldn't be asking people to put themselves in a potentially hazardous way unless you know how to handle that. In terms of action directing, whether you're a stunt coordinator, a stunt person, or just a director who wants to do more of that, I would say shoot lots of stuff. Try lots of stuff, but do it with your friends in a gym or in the park, and just try different things and make your mistakes there, and then compare it to the best fight sequences, the things that you find inspiring, and see why maybe it's playing differently. Why are those things perhaps better or more effective? And just keep doing it. When I was starting in this industry, that was kind of out of reach for a lot of people. I mean, I started to maybe 20 years ago, it was mini DV cameras and non-linear editing, and that was something very new. But now it's within pretty much everyone's grasp. You could shoot a fight on your phone and edit it on your phone and upload it on your phone. And I know that the 8711 guys do something for their new stunt people, which I think is a really good practice. They'll say, pick a fight scene you really like, maybe a classic fight from Fist of Legend or Drunken Master 2. Go out and try and recreate that shot for shot and edit for edit. And that's a very good way of learning, because I still feel that, of course, we've come a long way in terms of technology and so on, but I think for stylized fighting, I think the Hong Kong films of the 80s and 90s are still the best. And I see things in Sammo Hong's action films from maybe the early 90s that a lot of the fight scenes today don't seem to sort of capture. I think Sammo Hong's a master. That's my last bit of advice, is bone up on your Sammo Hong.
He hurts people, doesn't he, with his choreography?
I don't know about that, but he certainly likes to make contact.
In the scenes, it looks like they get hurt.
That's why it's part of the reason why I like his stuff. I love Jackie Chan. I mean, I've got a Jackie Chan poster behind me. But with Jackie's stuff, it feels a little bit lighter. It feels a bit more fun, and that's part of his appeal. But with Sammo, even if it's Sammo directing Jackie, it feels a bit more like a fight. And I like fights. It sounds silly. I like fight scenes to feel like fights. Even if I'm doing like a fantasy Viking movie, I want it to feel within that world like those people are actually trying to hurt each other. You see a lot of fights where people are just doing techniques and there's no sort of bad intentions behind it. And what I love about Sammo is you get these hard hits and people are taking hits, and then if you look at like Gangs of London episode 3, where Elliot is fighting Cole, that's Gordon Alexander, the guy with the axe and with the knife, a lot of the time they're really making contact. And that's what I like to do.
Well, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jude. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for putting up with me.
Thank you.
Awesome.
And thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next week. Take care.
See you later, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.